our presentation, so we'll start with that. Matt's going to be presenting Carnivorous Plants and Where You Go. Most of you probably know Matt. Dr. Matthew Montoya Rush. This is our back-to-back doctor presentations. He's been part of the society for several years. He and Albert have really brought a lot of enthusiasm. I mean, he's done so much with design. He's helped us with our website, with our flyers, possibly with stickers. He's done these shirts. So if you haven't met Matt, say hi to him after the presentation.
Hi, Matt.
Hey there.
But I'm going to go ahead and hand things on over to him, and then we'll finish our business portion afterwards.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Matt.
So Jess didn't say, but part of what we're doing today is what we're launching a series that we're calling Plants and Where They Grow. And so I just want to start off by prefacing this by saying that I am not an expert in pings. I did some research and put together a presentation to kind of educate everybody. My goal here is that everybody leaves today with a little bit more information about pings so you can move on and answer any questions. So with that, oh, I'm not clicked on my presentation. I don't know why we're not. There we go. So I am a researcher, and my overall goal first is to understand kind of the carnivorous plants and how they relate to each other, how they're established. So what we're going to start off today is by looking at an evolutionary tree. And in this case, you can see the 5 instances highlighted in yellow where carnivorous plants have been identified thus far within the plant kingdom. So first you have Ericales, which are notable with genera such as Sarracenia, the North American pitcher plant, Darlingtonia, the monotypic genus of cobra pitcher plants, and Helianthera, which are sun pitchers. You then have Caryophyllales, which are the Drosera and sundews, probably the most diverse group in that setting. Nepenthes, which are the tropical pitcher plants, a close second, and Dionaea, which is the monotypic species of flytraps. You also have Paeoles, which are bromeliads, and Oxalades, which are the monotypic genus of Cephalotus Australian pitcher plants. And then you get to the group that we're interested in talking about today, which are the Lamiales. And so these include both the Genlisiae, which are the corkscrew plants, the Utricularia, which are bladderworts, Pinguicula, which are butterworts. And overall, this is the most diverse order or group of the carnivorous plant kingdom. So as you guys might see then, we have the most closest relatives to Pinguicula or butterworts that we're going to talk about today are going to be Genlisiae, which are the corkscrew plants, Utricularia, and then finally the butterworts. And if you're not familiar with how Linnaean species classifications work, most plants are identified by their flower or reproductive organs. So you're going to always see me put the flower shape up there. This is known as system sexuale. And so in this case, you can start to see how the close relatives of the butterwort in the Lamiales are closely related in their flowers, but maybe not necessarily in their form, even though they're very diverse in how the plant structure functions. So Genlisiae, in this case, has a 5-lobe calyx, as you can see on the far right there. 2 upper lobes and 3 lower lobes. The calyx in this case is just a fused grouping of sepals and petals, which forms kind of a cone sort of structure for the flower. Utricularia are anywhere from 2 to 3 lobe calyx, and Pinguicula are 5-lobe calyx, again, the 2 upper lobe and the 3 lower lobe petals. So a little bit about the origins of where Pinguicula comes from. It was actually first established by Conrad Gesner in 1561, in which he referred to the fat and tender leaves that they had, but it wasn't until Linnaeus actually classified these in the Species Plantarum in 753 where he coined the term Pinguicula. So it means Latin for fat, and it's referring to the glistening droplets that resemble fat or oil on top of the leaves. And this is why we refer to them as butterworts, because of their relationship to the bladderworts and their buttery glistening leaves. Just as a quick side note, wort is actually from Old English, which was wort and referred to plant. So it's really nothing specific to the shape or structure of it, but it's also closely related to Wurzer, which is a German for root. So in this case, butterworts have 125 described species, and most of them can be split up into 2 to 3 groups of both tropical or temperate. And in this case, I've actually chosen to divide them between cold temperate and warm temperate in order to understand their growth behavior. And further descriptions of that can be that you can also describe them as homophilous or heterophilous, depending on the shape and function of their leaves at different times of the year. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to chime in, which is not a lecture necessarily, it's just an education. So my big question is, what is the function of pings? Or put it another way, how do the plants actually digest and trap animals? So we've all heard of carnivorous plants as being developed in nature due to a lack of nutrients. But what exactly does that mean? For most plants, there are 6 macronutrients and roughly 8 micronutrients that they need to stay healthy. And it's any of these nutrients that a carnivorous plant might lack in its environment that it actually is developing carnivory for so that it can actually supplement its diet. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the specifics of exactly which nutrients all these plants are missing, but the general idea here is that is why it's developed this trait. So the way in which pings do this is they've actually developed 2 glandular sort of structures. You have the stalked glands on top, which form mucilage, or a sticky sort of enzyme that actually allows for plants or animals to get trapped. And then you actually have the sessile glands, which are further down on the surface of the leaf. That, in that case, secretes digestive enzymes that actually then will break down the soft tissues of the animals that it traps, and then it'll reabsorb that nutrient sludge into those sessile glands. So that being said, some pings are known that they can actually secrete so much fluid that it actually will drip off the leaves. And so oftentimes that's why you end up seeing butterworts that actually have curled up edges that actually traps the nutrient sludge so that it doesn't lose it off the edge of its leaf. It's also noted that leaves, the butterworts specifically do produce a bactericide which prevents mildew on the surface of the leaves. And then overall, the major function is that they form on these stalkless rosettes with shallow roots. So just a little bit about the distribution. Most of us think of pings and most carnivorous plants as tropical, but they're definitely not. They can actually be found on 5 of the 7 continents without Australia and Antarctica being part of that. And they're distributed all throughout the northern hemisphere from US, Europe, Russia, China, and the Mediterranean. But perhaps the greatest diversity is actually within Mexico and Central America, with roughly 50% of the species actually being found within this region. And so that actually highlights the likely origin of pings coming from Central America and spreading out from that location. So with so much geographical distribution, there's a significant divergence in the function of these characteristics. From the cold temperate species, such as you see on the right-hand side with Pinguicula grandiflora. This is native to France, Ireland, Spain, and Switzerland. And it actually undergoes a significant form change from the summer to the winter, in which you actually see it form this habernaculum, and these gemmiae, which are little baby plantlets on the end of it. And this is its kind of winter dormant form. So it's often during this winter season, these pings can actually get washed away by major water flows and actually get redistributed in their environment, in this cold temperate environment. In contrast, you have things such as the warm temperate pings with its ping cerulea. These have no form change whatsoever. This particular species is present all throughout the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. And this is what you'd expect to see always and forever in your healthy plant.
How cold is cold?
Cold is usually, it's going to be variable because it's what it developed in its environment. Most of the time, as long as they don't reach a huge hard freeze, are they going to be okay. But most of the cold are going to be anywhere from 40 or below in the wintertime. As long as it's above that, usually they can suffice a lot of these, at least in what I've seen so far. The last would be then your tropical pings, which are seen here on the right with Pinguicula chylosecta. And this is also one of those instances where you see a drastic form change from summer to winter. In this case, it's not so much driven by a hot to cold transition but in the environment in which these are present, it's actually a significant change in the amount of water it receives in the summertime versus the wintertime. And so what that'll typically happen is you'll change from a nice carnivorous flat rosette to much more smaller rosettes. And at this point, usually they lose their carnivorous behavior and become a lot more succulent-like. And so therefore, it's the biggest thing to note about growing different pings is to understand where they came from, because that's going to depend on how exactly it's going to behave throughout its life cycle with you. So in this case, you can see that's the heterophilus, the different shape or functions on the two extremes, and the homophilus with a uniform structure on the center portion. So with that, I'm just going to jump into looking at a bunch of different pings. We're going to start with the cold temperate pings, specifically because Pinguicula vulgaris is the actual type species, which was used to describe Pinguicula. It is native to North America, Europe, and Northern Asia, and that's pretty much the reason why it was found. A lot of the Europeans were the ones to describe a lot of these species initially. And so Charles Darwin actually worked on this, Linnaeus, a lot of people actually worked with Pinguicula vulgaris. It actually tends to prefer rocky areas near the waterfalls and or lake margins within North America and Europe. And like all cold temperature pings, it actually has a cold rest in which it will form the hibernacula. And it stated that it requires a winter rest for healthy growth. But a lot of these, as we've talked about in the past, there is a strong likelihood you can maybe skip a winter rest. It's just a strong advocacy for allowing it to produce its normal cycle every year in order to maintain and keep it healthy for propagation. So vulgaris does come in many different forms, as you can kind of see here, most extreme with the flowers, and then it comes both in a bicolor form, an albina or an alba form, and this albicola form, which is actually said to have much larger flowers in this case. And so you know, I do have the conditions on the right-hand side. If it's the same general recommendations, I've just kind of graded out so you can kind of understand that it's repetitive information there. So the next one, it would be Pinguicula macrocirrus, which is native to North America, Japan, and Eastern Russia. It was initially a variant of Pinguicula vulgaris, but it's now its own separate species. And it has even larger and more open flowers, as you can tend to see here, and as well as it has leaves with this rich chocolatey sort of color typically. So currently, there is a subspecies within this, the nortensis, and there's possibly a chance that that might get broken out in the future. So do keep in mind when you do have indications for subspecies or classifications on your plant, you probably should make sure you pass that on so you keep track of it. The next cold temperate ping would be Pinguicula grandiflora. This is a pretty common one in the trade. It's usually thought of as much easier to grow than the previous species, with kind of a similar foliage as vulgaris, but it can be even larger in size overall. So the nice thing about this is it has these beautiful purple flowers with these deep purple veinings in them. And again, it also has a couple of different varieties with the pallida and the rosé, which is more of a pink sort of coloration to it. And one of my kind of interesting species in here would be the alpina. It's much more northern. It's going to be in Europe and Scandinavia and China in kind of the more hilly, mountainous regions. This one is a pretty small plant. It really only gets about 2 inches in diameter. So it's a much more compact, but it has these beautiful white flowers with yellow throats when it does flower. And this species has been noted that when it does go dormant, it doesn't actually completely lose its roots. So you want to be cognizant of that when you go to transplant this to a different location or move it around.
Why is England in red?
England is in red, sorry. In this case, it's showing that it's extinct in that region. So these, by the way, are all from the Kew or the Royal Botanical Gardens in Europe, where species classification is actually held and identified. The other color you'll see up here on these maps is going to be purple. That indicates that it has now been introduced into those regions. It wasn't native to there originally, but it is now commonly found there. So I think the last cold temperate ping we're going to talk about is Pinguicula ramosa. This is a really interesting ping because it is native to Japan. It is a very rare species because it has these small spatulate-shaped leaves and the beautiful pink and white flowers. But it is almost extinct in the wild. There's only actually 2 known colonies that remain in Japan of it. So if you do happen to pick this up, just be cognizant of the fact that it's going to be a harder plant to grow. It is going to be rare, and you might want to give it a little more special care. So there are many more cold temperate pings, but kind of for the sake of time today, I'm going to switch over to the warm temperate and eventually the tropical, because that's where the bulk of the species actually exist. So starting off with our Pinguicula in the warm temperate area, we have Pinguicula cerula. I started this one off because it's actually happened to be one of my favorites, just because of that beautiful, striking flower. It's, again, known as the violet butterwort, with pale green leaves about 4 inches across. And they're oval, but they're really strongly incurved, so they look a lot more like a strap leaf sort of structure. The flowers that you see on here are about 1 inch in size, with that purple veining and this yellow protruding sort of beard that's on them. And in this case, it's got these lobes, so it only has technically 5 lobes on it, but they're so deeply incised that it looks a lot more to have several more petals onto the flower itself. So this is probably one of the easiest to grow of the warm pings, and it's been said that it can actually survive many years. But one of the note on this is that because it doesn't undergo that form change, you might actually want to make sure you propagate some of these to make sure you can actually spread them. And we'll talk about that at the end of how we can actually go about propagating pings. Okay. So Pinguicula lutea would be another kind of stunning component. This is native to the southwest US. Similar to previous, except for the flowers are this bright sulfur yellow sort of color. And it's been noted that this one actually can be difficult to maintain in cultivation, usually because it flowers so proliferous, and then the plant just slowly dwindles away. So that might be a case where it's just not receiving enough nutrients. I've never particularly grown this one, but keep that in mind if you do happen to go for this particular one. You might want to try and discuss it. And we are going to talk about discussing and pollinating and dividing these. The other one that is brought up often is primiflora. Again, this is native to the southwest US, but you can see on the far right-hand side it's been introduced to Japan. So it is common there. It's one of the common species in cultivation, and it is found in nature in the coastal areas of Florida and the Panhandle. And it's often found most common in shady, very wet peat and sphagnum moss, often alongside the edges of streams or ponds. So, yeah.
Do you know if the introduction in Japan was intentional?
I do not know if it was intentional. I would assume probably not likely. Just because oftentimes when you do introduce these non-native plants, especially if it competes with another native ping, you're going to then possibly have something that could outcompete it. So I would anticipate it probably wasn't. But it is prevalent there. This one is a unique case because it is so far away. Other ones that you see introduced are actually much more localized, and so it's not uncommon that it kind of just traveled to other countries. The only thing about this is that it's also short-lived and prone to rot because it's grown in those shady areas. We will talk a little bit about trying to prevent rot later on. But this also, again, is one of those ones that can be easily spread by propagation. So if it's something that is having some struggling, you can actually divide it off and cultivate it further. So Pinguicula pumila is another one. In this case, is actually a pretty diminutive butterwort. This image doesn't actually get that across. It's actually only about 3/4 of an inch in size. So it's a pretty tiny little one. This one grows in the coastal plains from the Carolinas all the way through South Florida and all the way into Texas. It is fairly easy to grow, and it often will self-seed itself. So it actually will propagate itself over time. And it can have anywhere from these tiny purple flowers to yellow or even pink. Another is Pinguicula ionantha. This one I brought up mostly to cover that there are some endangered species within the warm temperature zones either. This one is also found in Florida, and it's found in very wet areas. It's very fond of that. But the flowers are usually white, nearly oval, and again, they're highlighted by that indent on the end, which produces a nice 5-petaled uniform flower. So the concern here would just be, again, similar to the previous one, noting that it is of a threatened status. So if you do happen to get it, make sure you treat it with a little bit of care. And the last one I'll probably cover in this area will be a species from a different region, because most of those were in the southern United States natively. This one is actually present in the UK all the way down to Algeria in Africa. It's also a tiny species, Pinguicula lustanica. And it behaves a lot like an annual, but it produces a lot of seeds every time, and so it actually will self-seed and grow pretty easily. Since it grows so fast from seed, this is one of the ones that actually is recommended that you, even though this is a warm temperate ping, you can actually grow it outdoors in much colder climates. The one caveat there is that you should collect seed at the end of the winter, because it doesn't really need to be cold stratified, and then reseed it again in the springtime when you're ready to start your outdoor box. This habitat is very wet, very peaty along the coastal part of Europe, and the rosettes are usually round, about an inch across, with translucent rolled leaves in a pink or red form. So from there, we're going to switch over then to the tropical pings, which probably the most common and what's often referred to as the Mexican ping, if people are referred to a Mexican ping, although as we're going to discuss, a lot of these are from Mexico. This is probably what they're going to be talking about if they refer to it as a Mexican ping. It's going to be Pinguicula morinensis. In this case, I do want to highlight again that when compared to the wet East Coast, to the interior mountains regions in Mexico and Central America where this is really grown, there is a lot drier and cooler environment. And so because of that, it's common for these pings to switch again from that large sticky structure to a more drought tolerant form. And that is most highlighted with morinensis here. In this case, you can see the morinensis switches from these nice flat leaves to a much more succulent-like structure that you can see in a lot of other components. And it's actually very common for this to be grown next to things like agave and tillandsia and things like that that actually would be a lot more drought tolerant in and of themselves.
Mine are not quite as dark purple flowers as you have in your pictures.
There is actually a significant amount of variation in the Pinguicula morinensis. It's actually the Savage Garden and other references that I used for this note a lot that they think morinensis probably is going to have a lot of subspecies that actually get reclassified off of this. And so this one is one that I would really highlight if it comes with a gathered region, a location as part of it, or any sort of indication of where it was propagated. Try and keep that with it, because that'll help you identify when they do reclassify it into something else that it will be pulled off. Yeah.
A lot of them will come with like an alphabet letter with them, like the mornings is Ibro, is mornings is C. So the flowers will vary slightly among like 15 different alphabetized variations.
The hard part of that is until we get a botanist in there that actually can go through and classify all of this stuff, you're just relying on a name. And the other thing I will say is that I came across pinguicula.org is actually a great resource for a lot of these species if you want to find a lot about these individual plants themselves, and they do have some hybrids in there. On their website, they have a location where they actually have the hybrids classified in there, but I couldn't actually get it to open up when I was referring to it. And as I'm familiar with orchids, the Kew, or the Royal Botanical Garden, is actually the resource that actually registers and preserves those hybrid classifications. As I could see so far, I don't see anybody that currently does that with Pinguicula. So it would be a really nice resource if some large institution actually did collect that, so that you could identify them by names. Otherwise, we rely on people actually to put both parents in there, and oftentimes that gets lost for just the cultivar and a unique name. So it would be something that I would strongly like to see in the next several years for a register for these. So in this case with morinensis, it does go from anywhere from 4 to 8 inch diameter leaves. These things can be huge, down to roughly 1 to 3 inch tiny little non-carnivorous succulents, kind of with a wedge or spoon-shaped leaves. The flowers in this case are usually pink, like we said. There is an alba form, and it does actually bloom typically at 2 different times, both in the winter time, and that'll be common for most of these tropical pings when it goes into this dormant phase. That's typically when it's going to produce its flowers. so that it can then produce seed and propagate itself for the next wet season. But in this case, morinensis also seeds at the very end of the summer, the late fall, or flowers. So that's typically when you'll see it produce it as well. And in this case, it's actually usually pollinated by hummingbirds in the wild in Mexico. We'll talk about, again, that a little bit later. So another one that's kind of interesting is particular Pinguicula agnata. This, again, is from Mexico. And this is another one that has a significant number of appearances that possibly could warrant separate classification. So keep that in mind. The true Pinguicula agnata is from the Mexican state of Hidalgo. And it usually has green strap-shaped leaves here that they gradually press down onto the surface as they grow, as compared to the succulent portion, which actually is a much more, again, small, spatulate, spoon-shaped shorter structure. And this can have anywhere from purplish to blue petals, usually with a green throat on them. And it's actually pretty short of a flower when you look at it from its size. Oftentimes you'll hear me refer to that as the spur, or the portion that the hummingbirds or other butterflies and things like that will actually put their proboscis in to get nectar at the bottom portion there. So another really common one in the trade would be Pinguicula gigantea. Again, this is from Oaxaca, Mexico, which is in the bottom peninsula, but all of this is a mountainous region. If you don't know much about Mexico, usually right there on the Yucatan is the only real place where there's a much coastal region. And as you go up into Mexico City, which would be located kind of right in the cup area of this green region here, there is a nice little valley that goes up, but all the rest of Mexico is typically very, very mountainous, especially in this high desert portion, similar to the southern United States. So this one, again, has those strap-shaped leaves that typically fall down as it grows up. And then it's noted in this one that the winter rosettes don't become fully succulent-like. Usually they rather just get more, oh, that's a really bad resolution on that picture, but usually they become much more of a tighter rosette to conserve their water. So on your gigantea, don't expect it to be completely dormant in the sense that it actually goes down to this really small, tight little thing. It's just going to cut back a little bit. This one, in this case, has very flat flowers, which vary anywhere from white to pink in structure. Next, we would have Pinguicula esseriana. Same area of the previous pings, not Oaxaca, but up in the northern portion. It's another miniature species from Tamaulipas. And it's surprisingly tolerant of frost in this case. It's actually only consists of these 1-inch small rosettes, which have numerous short, thick spatulate leaves with upturned margins. And the winter leaves are very similar, but they usually lose kind of those margins and their stickiness, which is typical of tropical pinguiculas. They lose any carnivorous behavior and turn into completely a water-retentive form. In this case, the flowers are lilac pink, cup-shaped with a long downward pointing spur at the back. And then very similar to that would also be esseriana. This is another miniature species from San Luis Potosi. It has larger rosettes with these copper-colored sort of leaves in strong light especially. And the flowers in this case are also very flat, but they have these round petals in kind of this lovely mauve form. It also does have a purple and a white form, or an alba form. And this one is also rather unique of the tropical pings and pings in general, Pinguicula lauiana. In this case, it's grown in the highlands of Oaxaca. And the summer rosettes are oval, sort of reddish, where the winter growth usually turns to reduced flat rosettes. So in this case, what you're seeing on the left-hand side is actually the winter rosette. The bottom is the summer rosette. And again, a much closer version of what that winter rosette would look like. It's compactified quite a bit. But this is very unique in that this is the only identified species of Pinguicula which has a red color form to it. And it can shift anywhere from a red to orange. And so I expect this to be used a lot in hybridization in the future. And then perhaps one of the more unique sort of pings would be Gypsicola. This is actually grown on the gypsum cliffs of San Luis Potosi and remains bone dry for most of the year. So at the time that it's bone dry, it stays in its succulent growth phase. You can see down here on the bottom. And has these nice densely compact compressed leaves. The brief summer foliage you see on the right-hand side is carnivorous, and they're roughly 3 inches long by 1/10 of an inch wide. So they're pretty thin, nice tentacle-like structures. The flowers are similar to Morensis, both in color and shape, but this one has been noted to be particularly hard to maintain in culture for a long period because it has to be kept dry for any time it's in this growth phase. It is noted that it needs to be at like 80% humidity, but you do not water the thing any time that it's in this succulent phase. So, and similar to that, another tropical ping with similar elongated sort of structure would be Heterophylla. It's from Oaxaca and Michoacan. It grows on the granite metamorphic rocks, and it has these thin, spidery, sort of arching summer foliage. It has a long dormancy, but it's actually completely underground and almost like a onion-like bulb. So I don't have any pictures of what that bulb looks like because you simply can't uproot it during that time. This is also similar to another species, which is Medusina, referring to Medusa, but that one is much smaller and has a different growth range and flowers, so they are separate species from each other. In this case, the flowers are lilac to white with this yellow-green blotch on the throat typically, and the spur is typically also green. So we then move to Chilosecta, which is grown in the shade also between agave and also kind of around like small carpets of moss. This usually grows on rock. It's been noted to grow on rock, which is completely bare, except for the covering of the dried summer leaves from the previous season. So in this case, it's a large kind of flat pinked flower in its summer foliage and a flat pink hue to its summer foliage. And then in the wintertime, goes to a similar small, tiny succulent sort of phase. The flowers in this way are very similar to Elhericea, which they're very flat on the face and round with the lovely purple, and the veining is also noted on the reverse of this flower. I'm a pattern person, so I really typically like that. So that being said, there are a few temperate butterworts which occasionally produce natural hybrids, but none are really known amongst the warm temperate Mexican pings. This is likely due to the fact that they are grown in very extreme environments, well separated from each other. And it's actually noted in this case that a lot of the Mexican pings are actually more similar related to their northern hemisphere, more cold tolerant, or the cold invited pings that have been washed down, rather than any pings that are directly in the native environment just directly around them. So that's typically why you don't seem to find natural hybrids of them. But there are very easy to hybridize a lot of the Mexican tropical pings. And I'm just going to show you a few examples of them here. They readily hybridize in cultivation. In this case, you have Moronense crossed by Chilosecta. So you get the transfer of that nice purple flower or purple foliage onto the much larger Moronense. And you kind of get a nice compromise in color of the flower itself as a result of that. Another hybrid would be something like Agnata with Gigantea. Again, a really large, big ping with something that actually might bring it down in size, but is going to add maybe a little bit more color variation. And the other thing you typically would expect with most plants is that you're going to introduce some sort of hybrid vigor when you start to hybridize these plants together. They're going to be a little bit more tolerant to diverse conditions that the species would then maybe die out for initially. And another one that I found particularly interesting was Chilosecta. I really like that coloration, again, with Gigantea. Now you're getting a much darker color form. In this case, I couldn't find a much better quality photo of what the plant looks like when it gets really, really large. But I think this one's kind of interesting and unique. Again, we're taking that Gypsicola with that Medusa tentacle-like structure, hybridizing it with Ignata, and you do get coloration and transfer over it. You get a narrowing of those. You also get a lot more standout stem and glistening behavior to those leaves itself. So the last thing, or a couple of last things I really want to cover is to understand when you have your pings, if you do want to hybridize, how do you exactly go about doing that? So most of these, again, are pollinated by butterflies or hummingbirds, things that would have a proboscis that would go in and out with them. But the striking and interesting fact of pings is that the stigma is actually present on the outside or the outward facing portion of the flower, and the anthers where the pollen is held is actually on the inside of the flower. So what that typically allows is that they usually won't self-pollinate. There are a few that will do that, but typically the pollen from a previous flower that a bug or a hummingbird has visited will be transferred first onto the stigma, and then as it's pulling out nectar and actually coming out of that trap is when it will rub against the anthers on the inside, and it'll pick up pollen to then take to the next flower itself. So because of that, it can be a little bit harder to hybridize them. But one of the easiest recommendations if you do ever want to hybridize your pings would be to take the two different lobes, the top two and the bottom three, and actually to pull them apart. You're going to rip off that bottom three lobes to expose the interior portion of your flower. In this case, all the important anatomical structures it needs to reproduce are backside of that staminode. So this portion with the spur doesn't matter if you rip it open or kind of macerate it. Then you're going to take a toothpick usually, and in this case they actually recommend for you to take and put black on it with some Sharpie just so you can see the pollen as you're picking it up. Again, you go behind that staminoid and to get the anthers and pick up the pollen, and then you can push it to the front to actually pollinate. It would be opposite or transferred from another flower if you were trying to hybridize with something that was completely different. And I meant to I had some pings in bloom and let people pull it open, but I just forgot to do it today. So what you would get after that is then you're going to get seed pod formation. Up on the right-hand side, you can get a general picture. The flower dies back. It forms this capsule in the upper right-hand corner. And then eventually, once those dry, they'll break open, and you can see an example of the seeds. In this case, if you want to actually propagate from seed, it's usually recommended for you to put this on a dense bed of either sphagnum moss or something that's very light and well drained. You want to keep it uniformly wet and damp during this, but you don't want to over soak it because you're typically going to lead to a lot of fungus, which will typically rot the newly forming small little seedlings. But the second way that you can honestly propagate pings, and probably the easiest, would be to do it with leaf pullings. So in this case, you can take a leaf. Usually the recommendation there is to grab it, pull it downward and away from the plant to try and get it to break off at the very base of those leaves. And then you can put this on some sort of hydrated porous material such as paper towel. You can use perlite, sand, anything that will maintain that, or ideally sphagnum moss. And then eventually it'll form its own new rosette at the base of that leaf, and they'll grow into much larger rosettes. And honestly, that's how we've ended up with a lot of our pings, is just by propagating from other people. So, a couple of common problems to be aware of with pings. Some of them are things to be concerned about, some are not. Usually if you have mold in your ping cultures, this usually means that you're either getting too much light or you're overwatering your ping. And so despite the fact that it's pretty much harmless, it can be pretty unsightly. And so the general recommendation is to separate and replace the top 2 inches of your growth media there with new, fresh, carnivorous specific media. Those would be things like perlite, sphagnum moss, sand often for a lot of these components. And I did have mixtures on these slides that you guys could probably see for the different types of pings. The next step for this would be to increase the amount of light you receive. You really don't want it to receive direct sunlight because most pings are actually shaded over by a lot of the plants that they're grown next to. And then you want to decrease the watering just slightly to make sure that it's not actually getting overwatered and causing that moldiness. Eventually, this can be a problem because if you do get too much mold, you can actually have root rot, which can lead to basal collapse. So in the case of actually true basal collapse, that will completely wipe out your ping. A good method, if you catch it early and notice in this case that all of these roots are dying off and it looks like it's starting to become rancid in there, is that you want to actually take your plant out of its media. You're going to inspect the roots. You're going to prune away anything that's rotten, and check for anything that has a nice softened texture. You want to take that off. If the base is still hard where the area of the roots are, just place it in a new fresh batch of carnivorous compost, and then make sure you keep the foliage above that soil line so it can dry out a little bit more in that process. Usually then you're going to take this and you're going to provide it a brighter location and again, reduce the amount of water it's typically getting. It will then form roots. But if it does have complete basal collapse, it should just be discarded because it's never going to propagate from that. And I think the last problem I'm going to discuss here is that if you actually have deformed leaves, as can be seen from these two examples here, this is typically a problem of underwatering or too much sunlight for your ping. So usually dry soil can be avoided by introducing it into new water. We water all of our pings from the bottom, not from the top, because you can introduce more rot in that case. But if you just introduce more water to it, you should have new growth start pretty quickly. So the important aspect here is that understanding pings, you need to know that diversity equals a strong variation in their behavior. So keep that in mind for whatever ping you actually get, because that's going to change how you actually treat your ping for us. And with that, really, are there any questions? Yeah.
So I guess the vast majority of the hybrids that I've seen have been F1s. Do we know if the F1s are also fertile? Can you cross F1s by F1s and have some fun?
I feel like I didn't go too much down that rabbit hole of actually deciding or finding things that weren't primary hybrids that were going into it. I'm almost guaranteed that they are still fertile, especially if they're hybridized from things that are similar. So a lot of the hybrids you do see are the Mexican pings that are out there right now, but there are some warm temperate ones that are also being hybridized with it. My concern, and if you did see where you didn't have primary hybrids, it would probably be there's more distant species that are then being hybridized. So like a warm temperate with a Mexican, it might not be able to then cross with another one. But genetically, they should be all the same number of chromosomes and similar in structure that they should be able to hybridize at any time.
One of the slides you mentioned, leaf pulling to keep the plant healthy and alive. Is that just for a specific species of ping, or should you do that with all pings?
I mean, it's
Get rid of the dead leaves?
you don't need to remove the dead leaves so much for to keep them to survive. Those will degrade, and as long as it's not rotting, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Like we said, most butterworts actually have a decent amount of bactericide, so they don't usually mold on their dead leaves. They just shrivel up and kind of dissolve away. The ones that I talk about for actually wanting to do leaf pullings for are the ones that typically are really hard to grow in cultivation. They don't really transfer on to that next year. Not really the warm pings, but maybe the cold temperate ones or the tropical ones where they need to go through those dormant phases. Sometimes if you divide them up, especially if they don't get a chance to go through those dormant phases, you can then propagate them and that'll restart a cycle where they won't collapse so much. So that's typically what's recommended for the leaf pullings. But also another great way is to go ahead and hybridize them or just even self them and get new seeds and they can regrow from that. So, yeah.
And these pretty much should be in shape after it's...
Most of them are going to be, just because of where most pings grow, they tend to get overshadowed by a lot of other stuff. So what you will typically see, and some of them were noted to have darker, this is not an example of it because that's a pigmentation, but darker, more reddish coloration to them. That'll typically occur when they have a lot more sun on them. Oftentimes that's not damaging or a problem as long as they're maintaining enough humidity and actually are staying wet. But if you tend to see it getting a little bit redder and it's not something that typically gets red, that's a good indication to you that it's kind of getting a little more sunburn. Just like we tend to pigment when we get too much sun, you can move it outside of that.
And just keeping your spag, whatever, like you say, water from below, the kind of on the spag, you just basically keep that at the usual moisture.
Yeah, so almost all the things I grow, usually we grow in cups because we grow them next to all our other companion plants. We like them best because they trap all those small little pests that are jumping around. And so we grow them in cups constantly filled with water. And most of the pings we grow are usually about 2 inches in cup. Again, these have very shallow roots, so they're not gonna go down and tap into that bottom of that cup. You want the media to suck up water towards the bottom of the ping, and it's gonna get fed through there. So you can leave a good standing amount of water in most of them.
Springtails are good food.
Springtails, and that's actually a note too, is that we think of pings as trapping a lot of stuff. One of the things to think Savage Garden notes is that you're not gonna get larger, like houseflies usually don't often get trapped on pings just because they have so much momentum, they can really pull themselves out of those sticky stalks. You need several of them to coalesce on a bug that's actually moving around. And that's actually one of the things those stalks do because they're sticking up. As a bug shifts around and tries to free itself, it tends to get more and more stuck, just like flypaper would. But
Yeah, it's small stuff. It's
Yeah.
gnats, it's springtails, it's, you know, if I had a nickel for every person that said, can I cure fruit flies in my house?
yeah,
Gigantea at full size, though, will take houseflies.
yeah.
Well, I mean, that's full size.
Yeah.
So that's different.
For the average Joe.
The other thing with Gigantea I forgot to mention is that Gigantea actually has sticky stalks both on its top and the bottoms of its leaves. So that's one of the things that can help, is that especially if it gets in between them, it can actually trap it a little bit more. And some pings, I didn't really have enough knowledge to know exactly which do this, but it's been noted that some will actually tend to move around and kind of envelop larger prey as they get trapped more and more on them. But I couldn't tell you exactly which species tend to do that specifically. So, any more questions? Yeah, a couple more hands up there. Did everybody at least learn something today? Cool.
Favorite soil mix?
My favorite soil mix, so most of the time is recommended here would be 1 part of peat, 1 part sand, and 1 part perlite. That keeps it nice and arid or nice and open, so you get good flow between that. But the peat actually holds a lot more of that water, and then the sand just keeps it from getting too much mold and things like that. So almost all the time it's going to be recommended to not be anything really strongly organic. The peat is, again, just moss that's been condensed down and broken down. That's the only organic component. Usually it's perlite or other things. And so even in a pinch, you could grow these on pure sand and pure peat, which is some of what we have our pings growing on, as long as you're getting enough water. Yeah.
What about like high pH? Because some of these are like actually limestone.
I didn't discuss that. Oftentimes, the temperate ones are going to be typically here in this case. I'll just go back real quick so you can see. The temperate ones are going to be much more acidic or alkaline because of where they tend to grow in the northern hemisphere. They will get a little bit more of an alkaline sort of substrate that they grow on. The warm temperate ones are typically going to be very acidic in their environment because they grow in a lot more of those bogs in very heavily, densely degraded plant material. Again, carbon is not the nutrient that they're lacking, it's the other nutrients that they're looking for. So the media here in this case tends to be very acidic. So they recommend higher peat concentration for things like warm temperate pings. And then for things like the tropicals is one of the things you're hitting on. Oftentimes it's even recommended, a lot of the new species of tropicals are not found on the ground. They're actually found up in the air, on trees, on rocks, on cliffs, on things like that. So oftentimes the cliff areas that these are found are going to introduce a lot more of an alkaline sort of environment. So this can actually vary quite a bit. It typically will have a purely alkaline, so that's where the 1 to 1 to 1 will be. The more acidic you want it, the more peat you put in there because that organic material is going to break down and become acidic. Yeah?
Does that mean they're more tolerant of hard water then?
I would actually anticipate they are, and I probably shouldn't say this, but in a pinch, I will, if I don't have water next to me and I'm watering my other plants, I'll just pour general tap water on a lot of my pings. Not on top of them, again, I water them from the bottom, but I would rather make sure it stays hydrated because all of my plants tend to dry out than I would worry about so much it losing it. Now, because of that, you might stress it out a little bit, and it may not go into its full dormant phase or things like that, but I will say I found our pings to be pretty indestructible, and they do every once in a while get a little bit of just tap water on them. So, cool. Yeah, one more.
The flowers last forever.
The flowers do last forever. The ping that I was going to show you actually started blooming before, I actually want to say right around Christmas time, and it's still blooming to this day.
No, I individual flowers.
yeah.
3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, well, and it's multiple flowers they'll put off. So usually they do last for quite a long time. That is a particular Morinensis, which it probably should have gone dormant. And so I think it's doing some weird things because it's trying to either change phase or just say, well, I'm going to keep growing forever here, so we might as well start propagating ourselves here. The other time to propagate pings, I didn't mention this, you can do leaf pullings from other plants, but they will, as they switch phases, either go into their dormant phase or after they flower, they'll then try and split themselves. And so you will get little pings popping off of that, and you can just break those apart and restart them someplace else. So, cool. Thank you, guys.